So this is part 2 of an interview we did with Chris Begeny, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Exeter. And we spoke with Chris in the woods for a long time about issues around gender. And it was such a long podcast that we decided to divide it in half. So this is part 2. Hope you enjoy it.
You're listening to the Forest School podcast with Lewis Ames and Gemma Sutherland.
Do you know Scroobius Pip? So he's got a really good. He's a spoken word artist,
okay. Yeah.
And he's got a song called "Thou Shalt Always Kill," and and it's lots of that, and it's set up of like things that are slightly taboo, but actually they're not. It's got a long section where it's like the Beatles are just a band, the Rolling Stones are just stop idolising all these things. And one of them is, "Thou shalt not think that every man who plays with a child who is not their own is a paedophile. Some people are just nice." And that resonates to me so hard because especially when I'm not here, I'm in my setting, I'm comfortable, everybody who's come here has seen a picture of me and knows that I'm okay and that I've got safeguarding certificates everywhere. But if I go out and I'm like, I'm really good at play and I'm really good at all this stuff, and I don't do it. I just go like, okay, I'm really going to sit back and...
That's really interesting, because I've never really... I mean, now that you say that, it's kind of obvious, but like, the kind of... If my equivalent of that is like, oh, I might not wield a power tool around because that's not my place, the outward perception of that is not that I may be a criminal if I wield a power tool, whereas your backlash, your potential negative opinion is actually really high stakes, isn't it?
Which is why I never took my kids to any toddler groups other than here, because I did go a couple of times with my wife because I felt like I needed to go with her to hold my hand and go, I have a reason to, which is really stupid, isn't it? To go, I've got kids, that's the reason that I should be here. But I felt like I needed to go. I nearly, I might cut this out. I nearly lost it with my son had his latest round of injections of, they do one in each arm. And it's interesting, having a mask on, people don't read your faces as well. So this nurse did not know how pissed off I was that when I arrived, she went, "Oh, giving mum the day off today." And I nearly punched her in the face. And then she was like, and I went, "He chose. We were both at home and we went, we're going to the doctors, who would you like to go with you?" And he spends more time with me because he comes here. And so he went, "Daddy. Daddy's the one that's going to come." But this nurse had gone, "You must be," and then the same as I don't know if you ever get this as well, but a dad's babysitting today, and you want to go, fuck off, it's my kid.
So a couple things have come to mind. One is similar sort of personal experiences. My partner and I were talking about this a few months ago, where it had never occurred to her that I would have this experience, but when I'm out, especially when I don't have my daughter Milo with me, and I smile at kids with often a mother coming by, I usually don't get a reciprocal smile from that mother, but it's more of a guarded sort of reaction that I get. And my partner Tyler, who's female, would well, I've never had that sort of experience, that sort of thing. And similarly, there's been situations where we're in the grocery store or something, and Milo will sort of run off down the aisleway or whatever. And my partner will say, when you're with her, you got to chase after her pretty quickly the minute she disappears. And I was like, but you've got to understand how people are reading a little kid screaming and a large bearded man chasing after that small child. And so, these sorts of gender dynamics had not sort of occurred to her. And of course, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to gripe about it. I'm about the most privileged set of social identities you can imagine. But there are unique experiences where,
I think it's just for me, it's interesting that I would say it's only in the parenting childcare sector that I ever, I was working with somebody else who was writing a blog about diversity and different privileges, and I wrote down all the list of privileges I had from when I went to uni to when I, what I do now, and the only bit of non-privilege I had was parenting and childcare, and just that thing of and also there's we've talked about it before, but you could spend your entire life devoted to child development and theories of learning and all these things, and in a way that somebody in another field might not have to. I still have to give deference to a mum's opinion in a way that you do you know what I mean?
Well, I was going to say kind of the opposite to that. I was going to say about so if you're thinking about places where you have privilege and places where you don't. So if you say like parenting is the one area where men may experience like a lack of privilege or lack of kind of respect and kind of equality there. But it's one of the fields which and lots of people will say this, you don't need any qualifications in order to do it. You don't need to have passed any exams.
You don't. I don't know that I would say I could go into childcare as easily without qualifications.
No, I mean in terms of parenting. So
okay.
It's not given the respect that it deserves. So I believe that you should be paid to look after your child. If you choose to stay at home and look after... If you pay somebody at least, at least £5 an hour in any kind of childcare setting, usually a lot more, if you have to pay somebody to do that, if you're choosing to do that yourself, you should be being paid that wage, I believe, in business hours. So obviously, at other times, that's just like family life, right? But if you make that choice, because it is a choice, then you should be paid for it. But you're not paid for it because it's not seen as valued as a thing that requires any kind of special skill, and it's a very female domain. So again, you've got that kind of like, well, women are not experts, women's work is not valued, it's not something, and I'm not against, if you are going to be paid for it, I'm not against kind of like more support for parents in terms of reading lists, in terms of learning, in terms of, I've done loads and loads of kind of like parenting classes and courses about children's behaviour for various different reasons, but that's not obligatory, and I'm not necessarily saying it should be obligatory. Your life is your life, but it's seen as a kind of like, that's something you do if you are a problem human being, you're like a problem adult.
If you're failing in some way.
You're on the, you're a potential drug user, or you've got a family member in prison, or you're kind of problem family, or you've got a problem child with a label. And that's really the only reasons that it's kind of okay to go to those kind of parenting classes, whereas for it to be a kind of much more widely available support system for a job, because it is a job, and some people don't like it as a job and they farm it out to somebody else, and that's their choice,
But there's sort of anthropological stuff, I've read in the past that has said that more hunter-gatherer societies, and where they would do lots of mixed age play, and society as a whole is a bit more open, they are perfectly competent at parenting at 14, 15, because their entire life they've been around babies and young children and whatever. It's not this weird thing that gets completely compartmentalized, and parents will mothers will take them home and don't bring them into the world, don't bring them into the workforce or into the actual society, keep them hidden, and then when they become valuable, that's when you can come out and do all these things. And it's like you say, it's a chicken and an egg thing, isn't it? Because you don't see children, then you need help parenting. But if you saw children, then you wouldn't need help parenting, or you might need less. I think about what an absolute racket NCT is that we've got to it, which I don't know if you know. So it's I don't know what NCT stands for. It's basically a way.
National Child Care Trust or something like that.
In the UK, it's essentially a way of buying middle class parent friends. So there's a free, you'll get there. There's a free version that councils put on that is, this is what your labour's going to look like, and you go, evening classes for what all the how do you change a nappy? How do you wipe this direction but not this direction, and all this.
It's very short though, isn't it? There's not very much funding for it. So you might have a tour of the hospital, very quick thing about what breastfeeding is, thing about the birth, very kind of biological. Goodbye.
And then NCT is a paid thing, which is longer. So you are buying middle-class friends because they can afford to pay for this, so that when you have your young children...
And it's a local group, so
you know,
just with a...
It's...
I mean, I feel bad knocking it. I feel bad knocking it because lots of people, it's been a real lifeline for them, you know, and it's like...
I'm not saying it's not valuable, but
it is.
But hopefully everybody should be able to access that valuable resource equally.
Exactly. And you know, there's stuff, isn't there, that's saying, you know, £1 spent in early childhood support and development actually pays off 10,000 times by the time that they reach young adulthood and stuff. And so, I'm sorry, we're not really talking to you about gender. We've just started chatting now.
Well, we just went for a wee break, but before that, you had like a couple of like mental post-it notes.
Oh yeah, let's see if I can remember any of them. So one, when you were talking about sort of like having a tutor come around to girls after they've answered a question correctly and say, "You got that right. That was awesome." You know, that sort of thing. Just sort of reminded me of some interesting research looking at kids' performance in math classes and how that changes as a function of a female teacher's own levels of math anxiety. So the extent to which they themselves have certain anxieties about whether they're a competent math teacher or not. And essentially what this research suggests is that you can see boys and girls in this class performing equally well at the beginning of the year, but then those boys and girls diverge by the end of the year. They've changed such that the girls are doing less well. I think they also are reporting less interest in mathematics at the end of the year with the same teacher across the year if that teacher has stronger math anxieties. And
because of their gender or just any...
I don't think it's explicitly because of their gender, but I think that it's... I can't remember now if it was studied only among female teachers or male and female teachers. Right. Female teachers tended to have greater levels of anxiety. But the idea was that in some ways, those teachers are communicating that anxiety, and in some ways, girls in the class specifically, the boys clearly aren't internalizing those things or picking up on anything. Their math grades aren't changing in a detrimental way.
We're pretty dense as a gender. We don't pick
that we are. You know, but it's so in all sorts of subtle ways we're sort of communicating these things. Something else I think that came to mind was this idea about like fixed and growth mindset sort of stuff, which it sounds like, I mean, I'm sure you're engaged in teaching philosophies and all that stuff, so you know that stuff. And then something else that came to mind was, sort of around this idea of praise. If you're interested, I'd love to hear more about it. It's by no means an area of specialty of mine, but I guess what I know of sort of like child/educational psychological research is that there's this thing called contingencies of self-worth. So basically, it's this idea that kids start to develop a sense of what it requires for them to have strong self-worth, right? It is contingent on hitting certain marks, right? And so the idea is that if a kid, you know, they do well on one math test or one math problem, and you go around and say, look at that, you're a really smart kid. Now in their head, they have to constantly establish and demonstrate over and over and over again that they are smart as a label. And when they don't do that, they crumble under pressure.
And that is that fixed
mindset
thing,
that's very much that fixed sort of thing. And so it's, you know, so the praise always, my understanding is that it's much more effective when it's sort of not just domain specific, but it's like event specific. Like, oh, you did really well on that problem, right? As opposed to, saying like, you know, and this is something that comes to mind, I think, in part because whenever I'm around other parents, I often hear parents, well-intentioned, giving their kids these very globalized expressions of praise, like, oh, you're such a smart child, oh, you're such a, you know, whatever sort of thing. And in some ways, it might not always seem obvious, but you might be setting your kid up for failure in some ways, or at least not being able to rebound as well or react as effectively when they do fail at some task or something like that.
Yeah, I'm reading quite a lot at the moment about demand in neurotypical young people and adults, and pathological demand avoidance as a profile, and it's really fascinating, and I think it has a kind of quite a wide-reaching effect if you look at like lots of people and children that you know, and it kind of ties into what you're saying really about kind of setting people up for failure. So a lot of people with PDA profile find praise really distressing and find it because it's a demand.
Yeah.
And you would never, unless you're really thinking about it, when you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, of course, because it does place a demand on that person to continue to be that, to continue to live up to that success, that praise, that model, which is an external model as well. It's the adult or the other person placing something upon them and going, I am labelling you as good at this thing. Oh crap, now I've got this demand that I have to be the person that they've said that I am, when actually I might not want to be that person today, even if it's something that they enjoy. So even if they love running and they just did really well, and you know the praise is heaped on them and they get that recognition for that, that can kill off that love because it's now a demand, which is just so fascinating that brains can work in that way. But it does make sense when you think about it from that perspective.
There's lots of so I would say Alfie Kohn is the sort of researcher and author who's like.
Have you read any of him?
He's got some really good ones. He's got Punished by Rewards, and Unconditional Parenting. So this idea that you, as much as we might all say, I love my child no matter what, the example he always gives is, do you react exactly the same way if your child comes in 6th in the school running race as they do if they come in 1st? You might say before they do the race, I will treat them exactly the same, but you fucking don't, right? And even if you're praising them both ways or you're doing whatever, so his things are like, one is that praise confers this thing that you need to be externally approved, and whereas he would say if you just highlight what's happened in kind of a neutral way of going like, oh, you made so and so happy today, or
or you looked like you really
enjoyed that. So then it's all internal stuff. He also has stuff that's subconsciously, by giving rewards and praise, we assume that the activity isn't worth doing for its own benefit, because why would I get chocolate for it if it was worth doing anyway? You don't get chocolate for playing, you do get it for doing maths. Therefore, maths must not be worth doing of its own accord. And also this just idea that you're, particularly the parent-child relationship, is I love you differently depending on your actions. And so his whole thing is kind of, if you are very praised, it is, he kind of boils it down to kind of, he's like, would you give your kid a dog biscuit when they do things you like and not give it? And then says, well, praise is verbal dog biscuits. It's verbal ruffle on the head and things like time out. He would say, well, that's social isolation. That's going, you do not conform and therefore you must be socially isolated until you conform, which for children, I mean, for all humans, socialization is, I was reading a thing about being the word mortified originally obviously comes from the French mort, dying, but now we use it to mean embarrassment, which is an interesting comparison, that being socially embarrassed is now akin to a type of death. The social world to humans is so important that being embarrassed is basically being dead. So equally, excluding a child socially is the same as death. And then that comes into it, doesn't it? This idea of like, well, if there's gender play and people are being excluded, that is a type of death. It's a weird thing.
It reminds me of some neuroscience research showing that, if I'm remembering this correctly, the experience of social rejection, sort of being left out, in some ways being isolated, essentially activates parts of your brain that are many of the same areas that get activated when you experience physical pain. So it's like a very physical experience. And in fact, again, if I'm remembering this correctly, there's some research to suggest that things like paracetamol can actually help dampen that activity in your brain resulting from
is it the
social isolation or social rejection.
Is it
norepinephrine? I'm not sure if that is sort of at the core of what's activated or turned on or turned off or not. I'm not a neuroscientist by any means, so that's about as much as I know of that research. But I mean, if somebody wanted it, they could look up Naomi Ellemers, I think, does some of that research. Naomi Ellemers. It's not Naomi Ellemers. It's somebody else.
We'll put it in the we could genuinely talk to you for like hours and hours and hours about
yeah,
it.
it's fun.
But is there anything else that you would say from your research that you go, God, if there's, because there's a few thousand people listening to this who are all in childcare settings, and so like the intervention things, is there anything that you go, God, I really wish that more educators knew about doing this to...
So I guess there's two things that come to mind. So one, which we've already sort of talked about, but the importance of everybody, parents, teachers, whomever, really ensuring that if they don't want the children around them to develop stereotypical conceptions of themselves and of others, it is not enough to just talk the talk and sort of say, oh, we value everybody equally and blah, blah, blah. That, sure, that's fine, but without walking the walk, it's just lip service. And by walking the walk, I mean like showing within your classroom that there is diversity on whatever sort of levels or dimensions or in terms of social group membership that you can think of, whether that's class or religion or whatever. That it's really, really important. For parents, equally, that means demonstrating to your kids that your friendship network is diverse. And oftentimes they're not, right? But sort of demonstrating that fact can speak volumes way more than any sort of lip service that comes out of your mouth verbally. So walking the walk is really, really important.
Do you think that goes as far as, because we were talking about this morning, weren't we, about there's like a fine line between demonstrating diversity in a group. I'm not so much talking about friendship groups, but like in your class, so you give the example of sort of demonstrating diversity in a class, and some children are at the stage where they are, I mean, in one way, through what we've been talking about, you're never really innocent of these things. You always have a preconception of gender or race or diversity as a child, but in some ways some children are kind of blind to it until you call their attention to it.
Right.
And so we were talking about,
so I was talking to my son.
Do you call attention to something?
I realised that I had put my foot in my mouth because I was... the example was we were listening to an album called Young, Gifted and Black, and it's a collection of reggae and ska and young, gifted black musicians. And my 3-year-old was saying, what are we listening to? And I couldn't, because it was lots of people, I went, well, this is all music by people who are musicians who have dark skin, brown skin. And he just was like, huh? Partly, we live in Devon, right? The diversity here is, for Devon, it is 98%. In the hubs like Exeter and Plymouth, it's 95%, right? Smashing it. So I kind of did, and then I was talking about some people we know that, and I kind of said, well, this person's got this and this, and I mentioned somebody that he's friends with, and I went, well, because this person's got brown skin, and he went, what? And I immediately went, well, should I have even brought this up? Because you didn't see anything, and now in your head I've given you a distinction
bit like
between
what
you
you're talking
and
about between boys and girls. You want children to be aware that there is prejudice,
and that there's a history, and that you go, that person,
but you don't want to create a stigma, create a barrier, and a difference.
Right. Yeah. So in that particular example, something that comes to mind, assuming your kid at this point has not explicitly sort of approached you to have conversations about race or something like that, one thing you might do is say, oh, it's a bunch of people, let me show you some pictures, right? And you show them pictures of all these different artists without making it about their skin color explicitly. Now, that being said, at some point, they will come to an age where race is sort of a common topic. Our daughter is now 5.5, and we have explicit conversations about race in all sorts of ways in terms of racial protest. We just watched Black Panther together as a family, and we talked about the importance of there being superheroes who are black, who are dark-skinned, and that sort of thing, and very explicit conversations.
Was that a conversation she initiated, or was that something you...
We initiated it because we had already had conversations with her about race, and she had started labeling herself as white. And for the record, she's biologically a quarter Filipino. In general, her skin seems quite fair or quite white, so I think in a lot of ways others will perceive her as white. But anyway, so that's sort of where she's at with that sort of stuff. So to say, my understanding of that body of research is that walking the walk is always a good thing to do. Talking the talk is where it gets a little bit finer of a line to play, depending on whether or not these categories, whether it be gender or race, are already salient in your kid's head. They're already actively working out what those things mean. And if they are at that stage, talk the talk, make it quite explicit. But prior to that, just sort of demonstrate it sort of organically, if you will.
Because I think that will be a thing that lots of people will be... So because Forest School is holistic, and we're pulling in all parts of children's lives and going, we want to, we don't want to just go, actually, we're only here to talk about maths. We're only here to talk about literature. Everything comes with you when you come to Forest School. And so there'll be lots of people, I think, navigating conversations about racial protests and racial inequity at the moment, and they will be trying to think about how do we have that conversation, without making it, like you say, if some of your group are having that and some of your group aren't, and how do you, a kid is coming to school and to your Forest School sessions, and potentially their home life is, we're going to watch these protests, we're going to really engage with this because this is our community and this is whatever, and then you come to Forest School and we've got to navigate that.
Right.
I quite liked your example about looking at pictures, so that might be a case of let's learn about this together rather than pretending to be an expert on it or giving, because that's another role that you are as an adult working with young people, is that and teachers often get tarred with this kind of like, oh, you're being too political, you're politicizing these children, you are generally left-wing, you're generally liberal, you are kind of brainwashing them with this stuff. And in one way you kind of go, okay, well, but I probably should be quite neutral. In other ways you're like, no, goddammit, like I know this is right, and so I want to, especially when they are as you say, experiencing in the rest of their lives maybe some kind of
you can't pretend it's not happening,
and some viewpoints which may actually nowadays be illegal, and that's quite helpful to be able to say that. If a child, especially a teenager, gives an opinion in a class and you go, I'm afraid you can't voice that opinion because if you said that in the workplace you would be fired, that's actually prejudice, and my job here is to help you understand that so that you don't make that mistake later in life. But things where it's more of a grey area, how you kind of tackle that in a delicate, you don't want to make them feel bad because they may just be repeating stuff they've heard, or the influences that they have in life. But I quite like that kind of thing of, let's learn about it together. Let's look at, and we've talked a bit about we want to talk a bit about screens at Forest School. So some people are very much like no mobile phones, no screens. Other times, like we inevitably, I'd say probably like once a fortnight, one or other of us will use a screen in order to demonstrate something that we
because you would need such an enormous library in that shed to be able to go, what even is this thing, or how does that relate to, and because Forest School is so all encompassing, if you want to talk to the kids about like an Egyptian shadoof pulley system, well, you can keep a book on Egyptians going, or you can just go, look, my phone has the internet, that's what it is.
And I used to defer to that in the classroom in terms of like the Brexit vote, for example, that was coming up, and I'm getting questions about it all the time from my tutor group, and quite a lot of quite very firm opinions that are coming out of parents' mouths and all the rest of it. So I had my own very strong views about it, but I didn't really want to go, everyone, blah, blah, blah. So you can defer to, you've got the internet, you've got a great big whiteboard, you can go, okay, we're going to watch children's news round. Here are, BBC, biased, non-biased, that's another topic. But this is a piece of media that has been created for your age. Let's watch it together and learn, and not and then we can talk about it afterwards. But I'm not kind of going, well, let me explain how the world is.
But would that be different if so you and I just talked quite comfortably about our experience of being men in parenting situations and childcare settings. So would that be different if you had a leader who was from that minority group? One, their experience with an issue might be different. Someone who's non-cisgendered, and that topic comes up, they might not want to be impartial and go, well, let's look at this resource together.
Well, and that makes sense. And I have an acquaintance who I don't know anymore, but who got in trouble at school for he was gay, and he had some questions in class about his sexuality, and he answered the questions quite honestly, and he got in big trouble with his employers. With the head teacher was really called in, pulled up on it, and this is after Section 28 that forbade the promotion of homosexuality in UK schools, put in the bin only really recently. And you know, his experience of that was very different to, as you describe, you know, somebody who is heterosexual having those questions and the way that they might respond, because how can it be how can it be balanced, and you know, especially if the questions you're getting from these young people are about things that are very personal to you.
Personally, I think the idea of you know, sort of providing students with a variety of different perspectives and ideas is always good and always valuable and that sort of thing. But I do think sometimes there does have to be sort of a line where it's not even so much like necessarily a personal sort of like moral or ethical judgment that you're placing on sort of those different perspectives in terms of which are right or wrong, but sometimes, you know, it might even suffice to just put them in historical context as to why you think, you know, like, you know, on issues of sexuality or on Brexit or certain political issues or whatever, why it's important to sort of give historical context to why certain individuals have not had the same opportunities that other individuals have had. And you know, for somebody to get called out or reamed out for sort of advocating for certain viewpoints is really unfortunate. I would also say, like, if anybody thinks that they're being genuinely neutral out there, they ought to pull their heads out of their ass. Nobody is neutral. Nobody is perfectly neutral. An effort should be made to demonstrate lots of views, but nobody's perfectly neutral on these matters. And even worse, to just be silent about it, to suggest, oh no, we shouldn't talk about those things, just is like you're just like throwing your kids to the wolves, if you will, of like trying to figure that shit out on their own, and they're gonna be picking up information somewhere. And why not engage with that?
That same book that I mentioned earlier, The OK Not to Share, has lots of examples about that, like and it has like little almost kind of scripts that you can follow. So your kid asks you about sex, for example, how do you respond? And her argument is exactly that. Well, first of all, you need to ask exactly what are they asking you. So don't go, okay, floodgates open, I'm going to tell you everything, and really freak you out. And that could be applied to anything about, you know, conversations about gender or race or anything that you might get fielded for a school or leader or someone working with children. What is it actually they're asking, so that you can pitch your response to the level that's appropriate for them right now. But not, as you say, shutting it down and allowing them to pick up their opinions about gay people, black people, or, you know, what is right or wrong about gender norms from other children or other adults or shitty TV shows, as you say. So it is better to address it and not be shy.
And there's some movement, isn't there? I would say, particularly this year, there's been some shitty TV shows that have gone, okay, we're going to get rid of this one, we're going to remove this from the pool. And so that is quite helpful, I think, to just go like, to not go, okay, we'll keep it for historical posterity and we'll keep that statue up because whatever, to just go, look, we'll put it somewhere, you can go see it if you want to go open it, but maybe we shouldn't, you know, on mainstream TV in the middle of the day have this kind of portrayal, or in the middle of a city we shouldn't have this person that offends half the population.
And Strictly Come Dancing, which is happening this year, I'm very excited. Same-sex couples this year.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, that is like a milestone in terms of, like, that is something that a huge percentage of UK households are going to be watching. And, you know, everyone loves dancing, which is great, but there is so much gendered stuff in there. There's so much kind of like the male leads and all that kind of thing, and the kind of ballroom formalities, and they've kind of been getting more and more relaxed in terms of like the style of dancing and the rules and that kind of thing. But to have same-sex couples as part of the show from the get-go, rather than, oh, it's a special edition where we're doing this, flipping things up. It's just like, that's happening.
There was a good. Did you see the VMAs this year are being hosted by? This is awful. I can't remember. But they were advertising it as the VMAs this year will be hosted for the first time by a black woman. And the comment underneath it was, first black anything in 2020 is embarrassing. You know, just to be like, you shouldn't be proud of it at this point. At this point, you're playing catch up. You shouldn't be going like, hey, aren't we a front runner? Aren't we doing this thing? And it was like, just kind of go, okay, we're just doing it now. We're just keeping it going.
That does seem like an important aspect of it, you know, making it not like a special edition, sort of a unique thing, and enabling people's brains to sort of almost subtype it as like, oh, we're doing this special thing where there's going to be same-sex couples, but then we're going to go back to the other thing that was all heteronormative, right? But you just normalize it. You don't make it, you know, sort of a,
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, again, we could talk for hours and hours and hours, but thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
so
No,
much.
thanks. It's been awesome. Yeah.
Is there anything you would say, like, people could go and read this book, or they should go and should people come and look at your work, or what sort of things can people look
I
at?
could post various resources if you want.
Yeah, that would be great.
Some links in there.
There's some cool stuff. Also, some stuff about single-sex schools, which I think is interesting, only because
I
they're
went to a
quite
single-sex school.
popular.
I taught in a single-sex school.
Yeah.
Gemma could have been my teacher. We worked out by like 1 year.
Oh, really? Yeah.
If I'd been allowed to teach A-levels, which I wasn't.
Yeah, some interesting stuff on some stuff.
Yeah, they're not okay.
The long and short of same-sex schools is or even same-sex classrooms is like, it seems like they're well-intentioned in a lot of ways, but it's not the most productive way of going about developing really sort of like supportive classroom environments. It's essentially like trying to, you know, it's often thought of as a way like to address, you know, issues where, for example, girls might experience sexism and that sort of thing if boys are around and that sort of thing. And again, this developmental psychologist, Rebecca Bigler, would say that like the intention is sometimes good, but actually what you're doing is you're removing the sex, not the ism. Right? And so, and not to mention that by isolating a particular gender, you're also making gender a super salient thing in lots of ways, and then they go out everywhere else in the world and see this, and they, you know, all sorts of
I
ramifications.
only recently realised that, you know, reflected on my own education, and because I went to a single-sex school, it's not sex ed, but you know when they go like, just so you know, lads, your voices are going to change and you might get a bit hairy. And I was told nothing about other body types. And not even in a way of like, you will have friends who are girls. Girls will exist for the rest of your life. And you should probably know about these. It was like, none of you have got a vagina that we're aware of, so you don't need to know about them.
They don't even know. That's the thing, isn't it?
I don't know anything. I came out of secondary school, genuinely, with some pretty fucked up holes in my knowledge that, you know, shouldn't really have existed. And if anything, they could have been a better space because we could have asked questions without offending anyone. That was my take on it, was like, you know, you might be in a mixed classroom and go, God, I don't want to ask that because what if I offend that person or that person? But if you go, right, there's nobody here, right, you know.
But that's also based on the assumption that, as you say, everybody's gender is binary.
Right.
Exactly.
And you are a boy, so you go to a boys' school. Like, what room is there in that environment to question that? And there will be, you know, in terms of numbers and probability, there are going to be several students in an average school who are not gender binary. And how are they made to feel when they're in that environment?
It seems like the other you know, sort of camp of proponents of single-sex schools is because they think that like boys and girls learn in fundamentally different ways, and that's pseudoscience. It's like there's something else.
We were told that single-sex schools. Again, we were told that single-sex schools on average made the girls perform 30% better academically, and boys 3% better. And it was this idea that like you weren't distracted, and that you know that we weren't a distraction to the girls, and that we should probably just be kept on our own in a little box.
There's definitely something about working in an all-boys school and teaching subjects like English, which we talked about being kind of feminine, and teaching that to boys in the boys' school. I'm generalising, but from my own personal experience, the boys in the boys' school engaged with that subject in a sort of stronger way than they did in the mixed gender school. But I think that was also a sign of boys in a mixed gender school generally, and also actually you can't make a fair comparison because the single-sex school in London, multicultural, in a very like thriving, bustling, like go-getting environment of like success was just so highly prized that it drove a lot of students to just like be super focused on their studies and, you know, go for it. Whereas, you know, school in rural England, a lot of issues going on that weren't addressed. There was no money for those issues to be addressed. A lot of social stuff going on where the boys were very non-engaged with basically everything. So it wasn't just English. Now I can kind of backtrack on what I'm saying there. Anyway.
That makes sense. And that's the thing, right? There's lots of really, really good single-sex schools, right? But is it because of the segregation of sex, or because they have really great resources and really great teachers and all sorts of other things, but people make misattributions to what makes that school high quality, and it may not be.
And quite often, single-sex schools in this country are, pass an exam to get in. So you start you start creaming off, and then you go. Grammar schools are, I went to grammar school, and it was like, you preserve 80% better. You're like, if you take all these kids out of mainstream education, and then go, well, our school's better. Like, you took the
you just cherry picked, all the highest performers.
And
I
proved them wrong.
Even if there's no exam to get in, so I worked also in an all-girls school, which was a faith school, a Christian school, and accepted girls from all over London. So people were travelling for an hour on the tube every day to get there, but had to prove that they went to church. They had to, someone had to assess them and their family, which even to jump through that hoop, even though it's not based on academic ability, it is based on a family giving a shit enough about their kids' education to prove to the people that they are doing the thing and doing the thing, and actually the financial ability to be able to set aside time from their lives and go, we are going to the church, and their confidence to be able to, even if they're not religious, to kind of go through that entire process just to get their kid into a school. So you've already got that kind of, as you said, kind of creaming off, haven't you? Going on.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things I'll give you a link to is an interview with Rebecca Bigler talking about single-sex schools, and she briefly discusses this big meta-analysis of all these studies looking at performance of boys and girls in coeducational versus single-sex schools, and essentially says when you control for the quality of students' performance at baseline coming into it, you see basically very little to no difference in sort of the quality of performance of students when you take all these other factors into account.
Have you got any recommendations apart from her in terms of... so I've had conversations with an acquaintance of mine who was a neuroscientist. I think that's her job. Anyway, she was super amazing in terms of actual brain science between boys and girls, and so all the kind of studies that I peddle out about, but boys naturally play with toys with wheels, and all. She's like, every one of those studies is shit, and I can prove it to you. Can, once you control for blah 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 blah, boys and girls' brains are essentially the same until a certain age, X, Y, Z. Do you have any kind of studies about that kind of thing that might be of interest to people working with children?
So one thing that would be quite accessible, I think, is, and I can't remember the name of the book, but it's a book about neuroscience and gender written by Cordelia Fine. And so that's a good book to get into. And then I'll also post maybe a link to a TED Talk that's talking about epigenetics, right? Which I think is an important sort of new sort of area that sort of dismantles this notion that people have a fixed set of genetics and that is what it's going to be and that will determine the rest of your life. But no, those things are affected by your environment. And so that might also be good to...
It's almost like genetics were invented by people who wanted to keep other people down and tell them that they could never do it. It's almost as if...
well, and it's, again, it's early stages of genetics research, probably, like all of us do, we're trying to put things in very rudimentary, simple boxes and without a more thorough understanding of those things.
Thank you so much.
It was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been great.
Cheers.
Cool.
If you like this podcast and want to support more episodes, you can donate through Patreon. Visit patreon.com/Children of the Forest to show your support for the Forest School podcast.